with one thing that I noticed at Bernie's was high turnover. Now we know industry overall, restaurant industry, there is high turnover overall. It's a very flexible gig, right? Like you can pick it up pretty quickly if you have experience. Let's say you like get laid off and you like need something that where you can start making money ASAP, or your car breaks down, you need some extra cash, like
Yep.
like what have you. It's really, people come and go in the industry a lot. But I would say that in my prior to Bernie's, working at restaurants, unless that restaurant was like new or something, usually you could find, you'd obviously find folks that hadn't been there for very long, but you would also find folks that had been there like 2, 3, 4 years, right?
Yep.
For someone, this is their career, right? Like the restaurant industry is their career. For other folks, it's a side hustle or what have you. And if they find a good gig, like they're not super apt to give that up, right? If they find a manager and an owner that respects them, if the tips, their average tips are really good, the hours are good, like why would they give that up and go somewhere else? But if you walk into a place that has been open for a long time,
Mm.
and like they've been open 5 years, and no one in the entire establishment has, that you meet, like no one's worked there for like more than a year, that's a little bit like, okay,
Right.
why, you know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah, it's important to think about that. Is like, is there something more insidious going on? What is the nature of the turnover? Because it's like you said, we've seen this time and time again in the industry. This is kind of a thing. People can come and go, and that's what people like about the flexibility of the industry, right? But during COVID, we were seeing a pretty serious mass exodus with restaurant workers leaving the industry altogether, or picking up and going somewhere else quickly. And in a lot of cases, it was because it wasn't safe. There was other issues happening that made it not a great working environment, whether it was emotionally, mentally. I mean, really, I think it would be all things, but it was a pretty serious issue for folks. So high turnover is a really good thing to look at and understand, like, why are people leaving?
Exactly. Next we're gonna move into like inability to resupply. So not being able to keep things in stock. And I don't mean like running out of something really little, like, one day you run out of like lime juice at the bar, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, that's obviously understandable. That's obviously like you run out of things, right? Like, you can't always order perfectly, right? But when you're not getting a full resupply, when the vendor's not accepting checks, or they'll only supply you up to a certain amount, or like when the manager is having to go out multiple times a week to buy, you're completely out of french fries, you're completely out of, chicken, you're complete, like, you know what I mean? It's like on a much larger
Right.
scale, and this is on a regular basis. It's like, why can't we resupply? Why am I not able to, you know sell 3, 4, 5 items on this menu to my customers because we don't have the supplies that like are necessary to cook these things?
Yeah. I had a similar experience. It came because I was working at a bar, and it became more often than not that I was being sent out before my shift to go get a pack of oranges or lime juice, like you're saying. But soon after, our paycheck started to bounce. And so it could mean that they are, financially not doing well, sure, but also like maybe not great at record keeping. Organization is an issue. So I have a colleague that likes to say weaponized incompetence. It's like, we didn't know, but that's not an excuse. That's not
Yeah,
a reason for people not to get paid and
right.
work in a good spot.
Yeah.
So a great too.
And by law, they're supposed to keep payroll records. So
Right.
if they're not keeping payroll records, then, that's a big, big red flag.
Yeah.
But yeah, so moving, keep moving through our flags. Management unable to access cash. So, if typically the GM, general manager of a restaurant, has access to some restaurant funds, like they have some petty cash, or like they can access the restaurant bank account for resupply, for, paying vendors, for paying
Yeah.
employees, what have you. So if there's such a tight control over the cash, the funds in the restaurant, that the GM, the person who's operating the restaurant every single day, can't access any money at all to go and buy French fries or something when you're out. Like, what is it that you don't trust your general manager of the restaurant to be able to access the funds necessary to operate the business that you're entrusting them with?
Right. Yeah, huge red flag. I mean, especially when it comes to money and anything transparency, which we're going to dive into in a second, is when money becomes elusive or a bit opaque, right? It's not easy to access, or you're cutting off anybody but ownership or people who are really logistically running the place and need to be able to access that. Red flag.
Yeah, for sure. Lack of tip transparency. So I'd say this is uh maybe beyond a yellow flag. Like, you know, they're supposed to supply you with the payroll, like rules, regulations, policies. They're supposed to supply that to you in,
Hmm.
right? There needs to be a clear tip out policy. So, how much do you tip out the bartender? How much do you tip out the food runner? How much do you tip out the host? And not like, it doesn't need to be like it's different every time. It's got to be a set rate. You always know whether
Hmm.
it's 5%, 6%, whatever it is, exactly who you're tipping out and how much. And then if that policy changes, then again, they need to notify you in advance and again in writing. So if you don't have the tip policy in writing and you're not notified of what that policy is, I would, number one, ask for it. And if they don't have it, then that would be all a really big flag.
Yeah. I've talked to a few workers who have had this issue up front, like, hey, we don't know what we make, our paychecks don't look right. And a lot of times it's like the first thing I would say is to talk to your coworkers about this, right? You want to make sure that everybody's on the same page as are other people experiencing that issue and addressing it with the employer. Because as you said, this needs to be an arrangement, an agreement that's open and people can access or look at, people understand where their money's going, how it's coming in and out. And that's something to really organize around. So great for pointing that out.
Yeah. All right. So next we're going to move into workers unable to count their own tips. So this is not something that I personally ever experienced. So Jessie, do you want to talk a little bit about like what that looks like?
Yeah, I mean, it can look like all kinds of things, right? Like, I've seen it where we're not allowed to touch cash at all. The manager comes back behind the bar, takes the drawer. We're not allowed to have a tip drawer. They disappear in the office, close the door. No one's allowed in there. And a lot of times you hear it because it's like there's trust issues within the business. People have stolen in the past. But look, that's really on management and ownership to figure that out. It's not anybody else's problem. It's like we should be able to see what's happening with our money. It's the sole property of the person who's receiving it, right? And
Yeah.
so a lot of times, the most ways I've seen it is that it's like money is being counted behind closed doors. Workers aren't allowed to touch their own money, and that can be a serious issue, right? That kind of dips into the tip transparency issue as well, right? You have no idea, you're not even able to handle the cash that you rightfully earn throughout the evening, and that can be, I mean, I would say that's even very red flag, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, for sure. If our red flags were maybe not such big red flags, I'd probably count that as a red flag. But
Yeah.
yeah, for sure. um Distributors and suppliers won't accept checks, only cash. So I know that this has happened frequently at many Bernie's locations and other locations owned by the same owner, where they would have food vendors, liquor vendors, what have you, who would no longer, they show up with the food order and you have a check for them and they're like, sorry, like, I'm not going to give this to you unless you're paying me in cash. And that's a really big deal because in the business industry, right, we're not talking about at the server like level where you're getting paid cash and that's a regular occurrence. But if you're a business paying another business, checks are still a very frequent, common method of payment, right? And so if they will only accept cash, then there's a really like there's a big reason as to why they won't accept a method of payment that isn't cash. They want to make sure that they have their money,
Yeah.
that it's, they're not going to find out in a couple days that that check bounced or that card declined or what have you, right? And they're
Yeah.
not going to risk pissing off a customer by saying I'm only going to accept cash unless they have a legitimate reason to be saying that, right? So they experienced this in the past. They've been burned multiple times and they're, getting hit with bounce check fees or what have you. And so they're like, no
Yeah.
more. We're not doing business with you unless you pay us in cash.
Yeah, that same thing happened to me with my first wage case when I was working for mom and pop. I mean, the owner would just walk around with a giant wad of cash in his pocket. He was just always using it to pay people, or there's just never any paper trail anywhere. And so eventually it got to a place where the vendors were showing up and they were no longer accepting checks, as you said. They were like, look, cash only, that's it. We're getting bad checks. And not soon after, the I wasn't working there anymore, but there was some servers that had told me that the police were looking for the owners because there was a warrant out for their arrest. They were writing bad checks to Costco. They were writing bad checks to, so it's just like that's why it's important to have the gut checks early,
Yeah.
with over things that are kind of leading up, right? Because it started
Yeah.
with me running to the bar to get fruit, and then before I know it, I can't cash my paychecks, I can't deposit them.
Yeah.
So it's odd, right?
It's no, it's really odd. And, if you're maybe in this live and you're not aware, writing bad checks it's a crime, but like just like wage theft is obviously illegal, but like writing bad checks, you can actually not saying that I, am recommending this, but like you can go to jail for writing bad checks if your employer is consistently bouncing your paycheck. Should you feel as though that is the method in which you want to pursue, like, making sure that they don't continue to do this to you and your employees, you can press charges against them and they can go to jail. And it's like, it's not an easy sentence either. It's not something where they're going to be out in 30 days if they get convicted, right? Like it's a really serious crime. If it's, large scale, it can become a felony. So, again, not saying I, encourage you to send folks to jail, but like, it
No,
it is a serious crime.
yeah, it really is.
Yeah. And so, moving into our like giant red flags where we're like, if this is happening, you should strongly consider, moving on from your employer slash like reporting things, taking action, etc. Uh,
Hmm.
Number one is checks bouncing. So I know that this was a common occurrence at Bernie's. Again, like before my check was late and before my check didn't show up at all, there were rumors of manager checks bouncing, not even like servers or kitchen staff, which everybody's important, but like if your employer is doing this deliberately, right? Which, sometimes we accidentally like write something, we think we have the cash and we don't, something comes out of our account that we weren't expecting, whatever. But if they're doing this deliberately, they need the managers, right? Like someone has to open up the place every day. Someone has to like make sure that you're fully staffed. Someone has to be there to sign for your delivery orders. Like you can't run a place without someone functioning as a manager. And so, it's in your best interest to try to make sure that managers get paid so that the place will stay running and they don't decide, oh, well, you're not paying me, so I'm not going to, unlock the door for everyone this morning and turn off the alarm. So if a manager's check is bouncing, you're kind of like, wow, okay, like something must really be going on if it's not just my check, but it's also the management.